When we play the chords C, F and G, do we play them like this? Or do we play them like this? The first one, right? But why is that? Why does that not only feel nicer to play, but sound nicer to our ears? The answer is something to do with voice leading. Now, when you voice a chord, you are essentially choosing the order in which the notes in a chord fall when you play it. So, what do I mean by this? Well, in a chord, you have 3 or more notes. On a ukulele, we've got 4 strings, but normally we double one of the notes. So with a C chord, we've got a G, a C, an E, and then another C. So you've got 3 notes, but 4 strings, so you have to double one. Otherwise you get a strange sound that becomes a different chord. Now, you don't just play those notes, because you have to consider what octave each of those notes will fall into. As you can see on the screen, there are lots of different ways of writing a C chord. You've got different notes in the middle, bottom and top, and they're spread out differently as well. Voicings that have the notes closer together are known as closed or tight voicing, and when they're far apart from each other, that's called a spread chord or an open chord. There are lots of different reasons why you might use one voicing over another. For example, on the ukulele, our C chord is a closed or a tight voiced chord. We start with C, then we only go up 4 frets before we get our E, and then another 3 before we get our G. When a chord is closed, all the notes are right next to each other, and therefore they contribute to the overall warmth of a chord. Closed chords tend to be a lot warmer because all the notes are together in the same kind of register, creating a really nice, smooth chord where all the notes blend together nicely. This is particularly popular with barbershop singers. Barbershop singers are known for their close harmony, and that's what this means, where all the notes are really close together, tightly packed in, which creates a really warm, vibrant sound, and the chord is really clear and defined. In fact, some barbershop singers will sing their notes flatter or sharper, so that they actually become even closer than they normally would be on a fretted instrument. They train their ears to be able to sing microtones, which creates even closer, tighter voicings. The opposite of a tight or a closed voicing then is an open or spread voicing. Now these are really useful because all the notes are really spread out from each other. That means the notes tend to resonate on their own as opposed to sort of functioning all together as one thing. Because each note basically has its own octave or half of octave of its own, it really stands out, meaning the sound travels well and carries through. Tenor banjos are tuned this way. With a C chord on a ukulele, you only cover 1 octave, and all the notes are within 1 octave. Tenor banjos are tuned with open chords, or spread out voicings. This means that as the notes are able to ring out individually, they're able to ring out a lot louder, and because they are spread across multiple octaves, the higher pitches really cut through, especially when, if you think about tenor banjo, it was designed to play along with a big brass section. Now obviously a brass section would overpower something like a uke, it being so quiet. So a tenor banjo was needed with that big wide open tuning so that it could cut through and be heard without amplification. This does have a downside that the chord as a whole becomes less gelled together, if that makes sense, as the notes are more prominent on their own, rather than with closed tuning where they're all merged together. This isn't to say that you can't play closed chords on an open tuning and you can't play open chords on a closed tuning. If you were to play an open C chord on a uke, it might sound something like this. That is a C chord, which sounds a lot different to. So that's the closed voicing, and then this is the open voicing. You get very different sounds just from playing the same notes, they're just in a different order. Something that leads on from voicing is the concept of inversions. Now, normally when we name a chord, we name it after its bass note. This means the note that is lowest in the order of the notes. So if you were to see them on some notation like this, then the one on the bottom of the page is the bass note. On a uke, it's typically the note that we're playing on our C string, because that is the lowest note, and in the case of C, La, that C is at the bottom of the chord, meaning it's called a C. Now what were to happen if we were to play a similarly sounding C chord? We're using this shape, which is like a B flat but moved up. Well, the note on the C string is now an E. We've still got a C here, and we've still got a G here, but then the E is now the lowest note. So it's still a C chord, but we would call it a C first inversion, or C over E. Typically in ukulele music, where we're playing sort of more chords and pop things, it's typically easier just to write it as C over E, which is called a slash chord, where you have the main chord, and then a slash, and then you have the note that's in the bass. So it doesn't mean C or E, if you were to see this notation, it just means C major chord over the E note. Similarly, if we were to play a C chord with a G in the bass, that G is the lowest note of the chord, then this is a C over G, or second inversion. So if we have a chord where the note's name is in the bottom, so C with that low C at the bottom, then it's just a C, sometimes known as root position. Then first inversion is where you take the next note and put it in the bottom. And then second inversion, we have the next note in the bass. So what's actually the point of all of this? Well, different inversions can force you up the neck. As you saw, I had to play a C major first inversion like this rather than like that. And the second inversion, I'm all the way up here. Now the bass note, being different, affects the notes on top. With this voicing of C, the E note is the highest in the chord, which might be useful if you've got a melody that needs that high E. Different voicings give you acoustic differences, as I explained earlier with the tenor banjo example, but also, again, they help you create interesting shapes and bring some variety. So, for example, you could be all I was doing was just playing C and G7, but I was using different shapes, and it created some interest. You can use these inversions during your playing. There are a couple of songs I play where I'll play where the chorus and the verses are the same chords. So I'll play the verses with different voicings to the choruses. Different voicings can also bring different strengths to a chord. Typically root position chords are the strongest and great ones to end on, which is why if you're in the key of F, for example, it's really fun to end with that high one. That's because the F is the bass note and the highest note, whereas here C is the lowest note and A is the highest, so the F, which is meant to be the main note of the chord, gets lost in all those other notes, and so it isn't as strong. This is technically then an F over C, or an F second inversion. So it's often much stronger to end up here, where you've got two Fs, one in the low end, one on the high end, surrounding the other notes, making it more satisfying to leave a piece on. The main reason, though, that we use inversions is to make it easier to play. If we go back to the example right at the start of the video, this is a lot easier to play than this. Can you imagine being a beginner and being taught to play like that? If you stick to one inversion, then it gets very chunky. You could play the same song with one shape, but it gets very awkward to play and remember exactly which fret you've got to be at any time. So it's easier to have different shapes and stay in one position so that your hand isn't constantly sliding up and down all the time. So actually, when you're playing a C, F, G, you're playing C over C, or C root position, F over C, or F second inversion, and then G over D, which is D second inversion. So even though I said that version of the F is relatively weak compared to that one, it's still a better choice in this example because it's easier to get to and you don't go having those awkward slides all over the place. So sometimes you can sacrifice what you might consider stronger or better inversions and voicings for the sake of ease and practicality. Thing is though, not only does this feel nicer to play, but it sounds nicer too. Why is it that when we play this, it still sounds jarry compared to this? Well, it's all to do with parallelism. You see, back in the old days, when harmony and chords and things were first being introduced and worked out in the Baroque Renaissance kind of era, often chords were not played by chordal instruments, although they were around, such as the harpsichord. You would actually have lots of big church choirs or lots of monophonic instruments like recorders and violins and things like that. They could only play one note at a time. Now, voicing kind of comes from the fact that it's choirs where most of the voicing practice comes from, using your voice. You see, in a choir, each person is singing their own melody, but you then get the different melodies that layer up that become the overall chord. It's a bit like strings. Say the C string was your bass, the E your tenor, the G your alto, and the A your soprano. Each string on its own creates a different melody. So the C string's melody is, and the A string's melody is. See how each string has its own melody, but then they all come together to create one big chord. Now that's the same with the choirs, as I just said, they all have their own melody. But the thing is, with those melodies, they have to be singable. You don't want any awkward jumps like da-ha, or anything that's really hard to sing, especially when this music was being written for weekly church services. So people only had a week, and they were quite often amateurs, so learning anything that was too complex wouldn't have been very good at all, both from a practical element and a sound element, because they wouldn't have had enough practice to pull those difficult leaps off. They also wanted to avoid parallel motion, which is where two notes of the same interval travel in the same direction. When you've got a C chord going up to an F chord with the same shape, all the strings go up by the same number of frets. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That parallel motion is very blocky and chunky and is not a very strong musical device. Instead, you want to create contra motion, where the lines go in different directions to each other. So if you go from C to F, the A string goes down 3 frets, the E string goes down 1 fret, the C string stays the same, and the G string goes up 2 frets. They all go in different directions and by different amounts, getting rid of any parallelism and creating really smooth, lovely harmony and textures that would have really suited vocal choirs back in the 1600s. It's through this tradition that we've come to expect contra motion as opposed to parallel motion, which is why it sounds a lot better when you go through different inversions rather than having the same voicing up and down all the time. Parallelism can sound very archaic and sort of old-fashioned, ancient if you like. Sounds very ancient and sort of evokes ideas of even the caveman or the Bronze Stone Age kind of era. Harmony is designed to be modern, and so it avoids using octaves and fifths and parallel motion, and uses lots of juicy thirds and sixths, and uses contra motion. To conclude then, good voice leading is where you voice chords so that they all flow smoothly into one another. Sometimes it's good to use a strong voicing or a strong inversion, perhaps to end on, but other times it's good to use weaker voicings and mix the voicings up to create smooth, nicely flowing chords, and perhaps even to consider the melody that you're playing, and of course makes it easier to play as well. So when you're playing a piece and composing, do try and consider your voice leading. If you're playing about with some fancy chords, try and make the transitions as smooth as possible. Move by as few frets as possible, but try and make sure each string moves by a different number of frets. Not only does this make it easier to play, but it also fits in tradition and what we've come to expect through hundreds of years of being accustomed and exposed to contra motion thirds. I hope you've enjoyed this video. Please let me know in the comments what you'd like to see in the next video. And if you would be so kind, please leave a tip at my PayPal. The address is in the description below. Any penny going towards me does help me in these funny, gigless times. I really do appreciate it, and it means I can make more videos for you. This was quite a long video, so I'm going to do a slightly shorter video next time with a more simple and arguably more useful topic. I got quite nerdy today, didn't I? So until next time, uke players, take care.